Welcome, welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Bredos, and I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The stalling to pass the Freedom to Vote Act is a historic moment for the country, a once-in-a-generation moment, pivotal to the very survival of American democracy as we know it. Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign has called the stalling a dramatic and moral failure. The bill would have gone a long way toward protecting the country's electoral system. Currently, GOP-led state legislatures have passed more than 30 laws restricting ballot access and have introduced at least 400 others in 49 states in 2021 legislative sessions. Trump's insistence on the big lie that the electoral system was rigged gives Republican officials the cover to literally try and rig the electoral system themselves. The president of the American First Policy Institute and former policy director in the Trump White House is drafting legislation to introduce Congress if Trump is elected in 2024. As he says, if we do our job right, we'll have model legislation to bring a federal policy in line with restrictive states' policies and laws. Our guest today on the Radical Imagination is Judy Jorrisch, a community and labor union organizer and activist who spent a lifetime fighting as an advocate for democracy in the United States, Africa, and Latin America. She's worked on dozens of local, state, and national electoral campaigns and was one of the leading and founding leaders of the Rainbow Lobby, a national grassroots organization that drafted and supported ballot access and fair elections voting rights legislation. She's also the founder of a groundbreaking organization that seeks to address the health disparities in the treatment of asthma through a creative music and health wellness initiative called Breathe the Music Network. This umbrella organization includes a Creating Democracy Network, which combines community wellness with policies and programs to help create and sustain a vibrant and participatory democracy. So, Judy, welcome to the Radical Imagination. Hi. And we showed a clip, of course, from As Good as It Gets with Holly Hunter and Harold Ramis, which was an beginning of the show here, which indicated the health disparities, particularly in the area of asthma. And so let's begin by talking about this really interesting program you've developed here. Why asthma? Why is this something you've chosen to include in your organizing?
Well, I've been involved in two directions at once for many years. Well, you go back to labor organizing, which is going back, some 40 years ago. I was doing that. For the last 30 years, I've really been involved in healthcare reform and education reform, and have seen on the ground the devastating effects that asthma has on the community. And it crosses all sociological, all racial lines, all economic lines. But the impact of it is much greater on poor communities because of environmental conditions, as well as certain predispositions in Black and Latino communities to asthma. So I've worked in a community health program for children where we saw that the asthma rates, for example, in homeless shelters and in city projects where there's extensive mold, for example, some of the key triggers for asthma, sometimes go to the point of 1 to 4, 1 out of 4, 1 out of 2 children are suffering from asthma.
What age group are you talking about here? What age group?
Well, from 2 to 18, 20. Adults have asthma as well. So there are a number of things about this. One is the skyrocketing rates of asthma among all communities. After Hurricane Sandy, for example, the mold that was prevalent in every household in New Jersey had skyrocketing rates of asthma in middle class and upper middle class families because of the mold in the housing. Of course, the more that the mold spreads in housing projects and older homes, the more severe the symptoms are going to be. But there's another issue about the disparity of care, which is that for most poor communities or even working class communities without sufficient insurance, and particularly those families that don't qualify for Medicaid but can't afford good insurance, the doctor of choice ends up being the emergency room.
Mm.
And emergency room care is very different than preventive medical care in what we would call a medical home, where you have a doctor that you see, you have a primary physician who is overseeing your long-term care. And the problem with asthma is that it really has been stigmatized for a very long time. People don't want to have asthma, they deny having asthma, and they think that an attack is when you have asthma and don't see it as a chronic condition that could prevent attacks. And so by the time you get to the emergency room, you're in an acute state, you're in a panic, you're in an attack. And the job of the emergency room physician is to stabilize a patient, to get them out of the acute attack stage and send them home. Their job isn't to educate the patient and the family about how to prevent an attack. So what happens is an endless cycle of stopping the attack, going home, the same triggers, the same conditions that will then trigger another attack. And so families and kids are never treated in a way that's preventive. It includes different medicines, different treatment. They're never getting the medical care they need to prevent an attack. And that's true in communities across the country. So it's not only that you're getting worse care, it's that you're getting different care.
Mhm.
But one of the things that happens over generations for families that do see a pulmonologist or who see well-versed primary physicians who understand asthma, for generations, doctors have said to parents, get the kid a trumpet, give them music lessons, give them a wind instrument, a brass instrument, help them to build their lung capacity, learn breathing techniques. And that, in fact, reduces asthma symptoms and helps prevent attacks. Now, many kids outgrow asthma as their lungs develop, as they grow up, and mostly through lung development, both physiologically and functionally. Many kids can outgrow asthma. But the environmental conditions, which produce so many triggers, another main trigger of asthma are roach droppings. So
Mm.
you can see that the things that dander, dust, mold, things that are more prevalent in housing projects and poor homes are the very things that make asthma worse. So what's the impact of that? Not only is somebody suffering from an attack and the fear and the terror of not being able to breathe, but when you speak to teachers and you talk to schools, one of the major problems is absences from asthma, or that kids who come to school after an asthma attack, having been up all night, fall asleep, can't concentrate, can't perform well. Parents miss days at work. I worked with families in homeless shelters, and while we did a study of the rates of asthma in the homeless shelters, I always wanted to do a study of how much asthma contributed to homelessness, because parents kept missing work in order to take
Mhm.
themselves and their kids to the hospital for emergency treatment, or they were too tired or too sick to get to work or to get to school. And I suspect that there's a direct link between the severity and prevalence of asthma attacks and the number of people who lose their jobs and lose their homes. So, as it happened, I worked for 10 years on various asthma projects and really saw devastating impact on health and social conditions of people suffering from it, and the degree to which people didn't even want to admit that they had it. So the health community and public education in general has made a lot of strides. I'm sure people have seen ads where they're saying, I take my asthma medicine. Now I prevent it. I have the pump to prevent attacks." So there's been some gains and strides made in seeing it as a chronic illness, and the CHIP program and the Obamacare and all of the Affordable Care Act made great strides in getting preventive care and ongoing care available to many more people. But it's still the case that the costs for asthma medicines have gone up so much, skyrocketing rates here, make it very difficult for families to sustain the proper kind of preventive medical treatments. And the discussion that we were saying before about getting a kid a wind instrument or getting them enrolled in a choir or being involved in singing isn't something that was ever set up on a national scale, was ever set up systematically. It was always a one-on-one conversation between a doctor and a family. I was talking to a friend about this, and he said, "Oh my God, my doctor told my mother in 1947 to get me a trumpet to deal with my asthma." So this has been known for generations. And at one point, after leaving a medical program that I was working with, I began working with a community music school. I was consulting with them on growing and building programs. And it became really apparent that so many kids with asthma were benefiting without even knowing why from being in a choir or being in a trumpet class or a jazz class. And I began talking with the kids and began thinking about, is there some way that we can there must be somebody that's doing this on a more systemic and systematic scale to get kids involved in music programs. And I began researching it. And the only ones I could find were in England and in Australia. Nothing in the United States with ongoing music lessons. There was one program that used music therapy to treat asthma, but it was just a very small music aspect to the program. And we had begun to do it in the medical program in the Bronx, where we had kids playing flutes as a part of the program, but it really didn't grow. It was just a small piece of this. So when I was working in the music school, I began exploring a way that we could help recruit kids in New Jersey who actually had asthma, who weren't involved in music lesson, and began targeting kids with asthma to join ongoing serious music programs. And I began asking some of the kids who were already in the choir program and in the jazz program if they themselves or if they knew anybody with asthma. And one of the kids said to me, she was 11 years old, and she said, "Oh, yeah, absolutely. I have a friend who's in the choir with me at school. And she told me that since she's been in the choir, she never gets asthma attacks anymore because she's learned how to breathe." And her older sister said, "That's true for me too. I have a friend who's in choir, and he's also on the football team." And I asked him, "How come you can sing in choir and hold a note and never use your pump, but you're always pumping on the football field?" He said, "Well, because I know how to breathe in choir. I don't know how to breathe in football."
Interesting.
And I was astonished at the sort of automatic responses without even knowing, without even being self-conscious about it, that the very act of singing and the exercises and the breathing techniques that you use, both for instruments and for singing by themselves, begin to give the children the confidence to respond when they begin, and the physical efficacy of their lungs responds to the same techniques. The other thing that happens when someone begins to have an attack is that you feel like your breathing and your breath has taken control of your body. And what happens to singers and musicians is that they are in control of their breath. rather than the other way around. And so their response is less of a panic response to the beginning of an attack. And they begin to counterintuitively to breathe more deeply. What happens when you have an attack is you start to hyperventilate, you start breathing very shallow, you start the very thing that exacerbates the attack. So on a subjective level, the techniques that people learn in singing and in music gives them the control and the confidence to do the very thing that helps repress and prevent an attack to begin with. So it's both physiological and psychological, if you will, a confidence boosting sense of I'm in control of my breath. I'm not a victim of this condition I have.
Interesting. Wow. There's a lot of questions here and points to be made. You pointed out the history of this in a fascinating way. I know we've had, I told you, we've had Felipe Luciano on Young Lords, and of course,
Right.
part of the takeover of the Lincoln Hospital was rooted in their understanding and their awareness of how asthma was affecting their community in the South Bronx, and
Yes.
so that was then, that was decades ago. I'm curious. Was the medical profession, you found doctors familiar with the connections made that you're making between music and learning?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Really?
For
They knew.
generations. For generations. And so there are a couple of, there's one other point, a very, very important point I want to make around education and the social cost of asthma. So every time somebody goes to an emergency room, it's between $1,200 and $1,500 of social costs that are either borne by city if they're poor patients that aren't paying, if it's Medicaid, or if it's private insurance. It's a social cost that could be eliminated. Secondly, every time a kid is absent from school, it's a cost to the city and to the school district because they lose money every time a child is absent, let alone the devastating effect on learning. If you're missing large numbers of classes, large amounts of school, kids can't catch up, they're always behind. Or if you're sitting in school and having spent the whole night coughing and not being able to sleep, very often teachers say they find kids are putting their heads down and they can't concentrate and they're sleepy and unable to really learn. So the social costs, both literal dollars in terms of the cost of emergency rooms, places in emergency rooms that are taken up by and other people with real emergencies aren't being seen, and the social cost to society of children not learning, not being prepared, of poor academic outcomes, and then literally the schools not getting the income from absent students. So it's billions of dollars a year, and cities and governments began to realize that in doing a great deal of education around preventing asthma and taking your medicines and getting kids proper care. But there's
But
still
also, Judy, haven't they cut music programs? Haven't they cut the music programs in
and they've
school?
cut music programs. Exactly. Exactly.
Which is the opposite of what you be advocating.
Precisely. So having built national programs, sort of satellite programs all around the country and being part of national networks of organizations, what I found was that on the music side, people didn't understand really how to connect to the health side. And while doctors knew about the benefits of certain kinds of music education on the effects of lungs and diminishing asthma treatments, they didn't know how to set up a music program. They were just recommending that the parents get kids involved in it. So I began to think about how I could structure something to set up an ongoing program that could be replicated and a model that people could use in schools and community networks and community health centers that people could just plug into, that would have the broad outlines of education around asthma, teaching kids what asthma is about, how to handle it, and at the same time engaging them in music classes, which we know are educationally beneficial across the board. Kids improve who are participating in music lessons. They improve academically. Their math improves. Their moods improves. Their social skills improve. And the generic and generalized benefits of music education go far beyond just asthma, so that every kid benefits from music education. And I began reaching out to different musicians about participating with us and being teaching artists to work on setting up some pilot programs. And what I began to find were musicians who became musicians because they had asthma, and they had been told, their parents had been told, get the music lessons. And this is universal. It's across the world, not just in the United States. So I spoke to one woman who plays the gaita, which is the like the bagpipes, but it's a Spanish version of the bagpipes. And I began telling her what I was doing, and she looked at me strangely and she said, "Did you know I had asthma as a child? That's why I play this. I was 4 years old, and my mother took me to the doctor, and he said, well, have her blow balloons. It'll help build her lungs." And my mother said, well, what about gaita lessons? And he said, well, that would be fine if she's not too young. And I started on this instrument when I was 4 years old. And at some point in Spain, doctors tried to do exactly what you were doing, set up music programs for kids with asthma, but they didn't know how to actualize it. They knew about medicine. They didn't know how to set up a music school. And she said they had this same idea 20 years ago. So this is universal. It's the asthma rates all across the world are skyrocketing because of the environment. So that's how this notion of a community-based program that can be modeled and customized to every community. So it's a three-pronged program. It's could either be in a school, it could be at a church, it could be at a community music school, a public school, a private school, community center, with a music class, choir, or music instruments. And what we have in it is also nurses and materials that teach about what asthma is. So it's in some way a STEAM program. You may have heard science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. STEAM programs that help children learn about biology and what asthma is, and how how a musical approach affects their bodies while they're learning the arts. And we link with doctors if they're in care to let them know that this patient of theirs is now in a music program, so that they can track their progress and see if there's any impact on their asthma symptoms. And we ask that every kid and every family keep a journal, which is a very common thing with asthma, an asthma journal, to track your symptoms, to sort of track your activities and triggers, and then do a graph of their asthma attacks if they have them, to see the frequency and what's triggering them. So it's a very common technique for monitoring asthma. And every child gets a spirometer, so that we measure it at the beginning and at the end of 12-week programs, just to take measurements. We're not doing a study. We're just observing. We'd love to work with an academic medical center at some point that will do the study, but we're not doing it. We're just gathering the data.
Through various pilot programs?
Mm-hmm.
Through various pilot programs?
Yes. So we've...
in Jersey, Newark?
No, we're starting in New York. And we've been, the problem is that during COVID, singing is the most contagious activity that we could have developed. And since we were just launching, it wasn't a moment you can't really start a choir on Zoom. Choirs have continued that have a history of working together. Though we are going to attempt it at this point, but we're now just relaunching. in large rooms to have 10 to 12 kids, beginning with choir. Um, in the meantime, what we also found is that in England, an offshoot of this as treatment for kids with asthma was that hospitals began observing how successful the asthma singing program in North England. They had one program, and a nearby hospital, I was going to say, got wind of it, no pun intended, and they saw how successful it was, and they began to set up choirs for older patients with COPD, and they found enormous success, both socially and medically, for patients with COPD. The same things were happening. They were building greater lung efficacy and capacity. And when COVID struck in England, the National Opera Society and the National Health Program in England got together for a pilot program to see if it would help patients who were having long-term lung and respiratory problems from COVID. And they did a couple of pilot programs, and again, it was enormously successful. And so they've set up a national coalition between the National Health Program in England and the National Opera Society, and they are continuing these singing programs for people with long-term COVID. And so we're now looking at bringing in music teachers to develop the same kind of singing programs online for people who are having long-term respiratory impact with COVID, or adults with other kinds of respiratory problems. So we're looking to add an adult component to it.
So, Judy, this sounds totally win-win proposition. Who could be against this? I mean, where is there? Have you found resistance? I mean, I can understand to a certain extent, I guess, that the expense of musical instruments might be something to consider here, but still, that I'm sure could be overcome.
That's why we're beginning with choir.
Choir, right? Got it.
Because everybody has a voice, everybody can sing, and
what could possibly be political resistance to this, or is there? Have you found?
There's none. People get so excited. Both on the health side and on the music side, when I talk to people about it, actually what was shocking to me is the number of people who are saying, I'm getting goosebumps. About 10 people have used that same phrase to me. I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. This is so exciting and has such potential. So there's no resistance. The resistance or the difficulty has just been in getting people to invest in it and getting the money and getting through the pandemic so that people feel safe being in a room and singing together.
Together.
So that's been the only delay in relaunching, and we're looking at doing that. And so we have identified a number of sites and sponsors where we are looking to do this at several points in the city as pilot programs here.
And how about the New York City public schools? Would they be open to work?
They would. We're starting with after school, simply because of the freedom in scheduling. The biggest problem in public schools is always scheduling. So we're beginning with after school, and certainly we'll look to bring something into the public schools. It's a no-brainer for public schools.
It seems to be, and I like that.
Except if they don't have music teachers and don't have music programs or money for music.
Well, that could change with the recognition of programs like this.
Absolutely.
As you say, is a political win-win situation for politicians to identify with. I love the term that you use, breathe the music, community wellness. Why did you, how'd you come up with that term, breathe the music?
Well, the idea of breath and a sense that it's a different kind of breathing. So to convey that by participating and being cognizant of your breathing as part of your music experience, it's, I thought, sort of explaining well why it was going to have a healing effect on your lungs and on and bringing a certain joy to it. It's not sitting and being with a machine and breathing. It's not being on an iron lung, but it's bringing a joy and creativity to your healing, which is much more appealing than I think just breathing by a breathing process by itself. But certainly, if you learn breathing through yoga, you're going to improve your lungs and your asthma symptoms.
Have you been in touch with, I don't know if this would fit at all, with various, I don't know even if this would be part of that, disability rights movements, for example? Is that perceived in this context?
Well, one of the, it's good that you point that out, because one of the things that I'll tell you some concerns that some people who, a director of a music school said to me, for example, but wouldn't this be dangerous if we recruited children with asthma? What happens if they have an attack? And I said, you have children with asthma now, you just don't know it. Asthma is so prevalent. Everybody has children with asthma in their institutions of any kind. And according to the ADA laws that have passed in recent years, you have to know the procedures for dealing with children with asthma attacks. So if you're asking me that question, what that's telling me is that you're not yet in compliance with ADA rules. And this would be a great way of easily incorporating ADA rules about asthma into your programming, which unfortunately you're not aware of yet. So far from introducing more danger, we're giving you a tool to which you can more efficiently comply with the ADA regulations that already exist. So that's what I found, is that people who voiced concerns really weren't aware yet of what their asthma oversight requirements were.
Well, and you explain to them, as you have, in a very diplomatic, very wonderful way there. So they now understand and they're on board as well.
And it's one of the things also is that the body automatically, they were concerned that by enrolling someone in a music class, that it could itself be a trigger and cause stress that would produce an asthma attack. And two things about it. One of the doctors that we work with said the body automatically will stop participating in a stressful activity if they can't breathe, unless the person self-consciously pushes through it, like the kid using a pump on the football field because he wanted to make the tackle or make the goal. And rather than causing an attack, they're engaged in activity that helps them do the very things that doctors tell patients to do if they're beginning to feel that they're in stress, which is to breathe more slowly, to slow down, to calm yourself, to not begin shallow, fast, hyperventilating kind of breathing, which is the thing that exacerbates symptoms. But the activity itself parallels and echoes the very things that doctors say a patient should do if they're in stress. So the other point, when you raise the kind of support, one of the things we've been doing over the past period where we haven't been able to actually engage kids in singing is to expand and build our advisory board, which is made up of doctors, leading musicians, health professionals, and parents and asthma sufferers themselves as advisors on the formation and of the program in an ongoing way. and getting doctors and musicians to be speaking to each other about this. So that in itself has been a great outreach process. And we're also going to be asking people to contact us to tell us their stories of their experience with music and its impact on their asthma symptoms.
I'm really glad you brought up this part of it, because the connection between anxiety and asthma, I think, is very misunderstood, and perhaps, again, as a political moment now, all the tennis players coming out and the football players and so on in the sports world talking about some of their own anxiety and pressures and so on. How do you see that fit into what you're doing as well?
Well, it's really interesting because historically, um, part of the stigma of asthma is
Mm.
that it's psychosomatic.
Mm.
Parents feel guilty that they've caused stress in the child. And so a child with asthma is a reflection on their parenting. And that's, it's an older stigma, but I think it persists that um, I guess the ubiquitous nature of asthma at this point has helped reduce the stigma around it. But um, so I'm sort of attacking that question from the opposite vantage point, which is yes, anxiety um, can make asthma and breathing and stress more difficult, but it's not a psychosomatic disease. It's very much a physiological um, problem of the lungs. And different people have different weaknesses in their lungs that require different kinds of treatments. But um, it's physiologically based, it's not psychologically based. But as with, any problem, a headache is made worse by stress, or you can get a stress headache. It doesn't mean you don't have a headache. Doesn't mean you're not in pain. Um, but
Point well taken. Yeah. No, I
but
think that.
asthma, unlike a headache, asthma is a chronic inflammation of the lungs um, that has to be treated through medical intervention as well as through wellness techniques to reduce symptoms, to reduce inflammation, and to uh, build your immune system and to build your body health and strength.
You mentioned before that sometimes you just simply outgrow it, or but is it more likely that you will need to have attention and medication throughout your life? Um,
Well, it depends on the severity of it. So the lungs are one of the last things to develop. So, for example, if babies are born prematurely, one of the problems is that their lungs haven't fully developed. So your lungs continue to develop as children grow, and it may the asthma may simply be a result of not fully capable lungs. So that's one of the reasons that children outgrow it, that their lung capacity and their lung efficiency simply improves with maturity. That just as everything else builds in the body, the lungs build.
yeah.
So that's why children will outgrow it. But for others for whom it remains a lifelong problem, you have to. That's why it's so important to be under medical care with doctors who understand what asthma is. And the medicines that you take for preventive care, the steroids, the other kinds of medicines, are to reduce inflammation and to improve lung function so that you never get an attack. And of course, people have different severity of asthma depending on the condition of their lungs. So some people can go off medicines by improving these other techniques. Some will reduce the intensity of the medicines. So some people take medicine and then also still need the pump. So the degree to which you can be less dependent on pharmaceuticals, the better it is.
Right. And that comes in with the music there again and the singing. And silly
There are 3,000 unnecessary deaths, at least 3,000 unnecessary deaths a year from asthma,
wow.
because people are untreated. They can't get to an emergency room. That simply shouldn't be happening in the United States. Nobody should die of asthma in the United States.
And the number of people who would be diagnosed with asthma, various levels, you would say what, go into the millions?
Oh, absolutely. It's 20% of the population has asthma.
Really?
20%. And in inner cities, it can be anywhere from 1 to 10 to 1 to 4. In homeless shelters, it's 1 to 2 to 1 to 4. And it's in families. So sometimes parents don't realize that a child has asthma. There's just the constant coughing until they have an attack. So they're treating asthma with Robitussin and with cough medicine.
Yeah.
Or they just think it's normal that you take cough medicine every night to stop coughing and to sleep. It's and then they become addicted to cough medicine. So it's a spiraling, debilitating series of things that happen when it could be prevented altogether.
I think they said my mother was sent upstate as a kid. She had some respiratory issues, and goat's milk was supposedly going to help, but that was maybe interesting. Who knows? But that was probably
or go to Arizona, go to dry places.
Yeah, dry places. Silly question, but maybe not. So I don't know. Does it make a difference if you, in some way, are in a family that tends to be more emotive and speaks more
less repressed?
Yeah.
Is emotional repression tied to asthma?
Like your family and my family, where there was more
yelling?
Yeah, more yelling or more arguing.
I've never seen
I know
any correlation between emotional outbursts and avoid ulcers, maybe, but I haven't seen it with asthma.
I know. I'm being silly here.
I think there are ethnic correlations. African American and Latino communities do have higher propensity to asthma.
In both America and in Latin America.
Well, African American, I don't know about Latin America. I'm talking about African American community.
Yeah, no, I know.
I haven't seen comparisons. Though there are high rates of asthma in the Caribbean because of the humidity and the molds and triggers that come with it. So I've always seen that as physiological because of the natural environment that is less
hospitable,
or is more conducive to the triggers that produce asthma. So in Cuba and Puerto Rico and Haiti, the humidity of the Caribbean causes mold and that thick air and humidity that makes it more likely that you'll have asthma. But Harlem and the Bronx have the highest rates of asthma in the country. Mm-hmm. Newark, close, it's the same as it was at the turn of the century, on the Lower East Side. Tenement housing produces illness. We know that. We've always known that. That's why they, instituted all of these health regulations and how buildings are built. But just as that fire in the Bronx produced fire traps, the conditions also produce mold, and that's a very, very big problem in public housing. They have not cleaned up the mold, and that's why you have such huge rates of asthma in public housing and in homeless shelters.
Judy, you've done so much organizing, labor organizing.
I know you keep talking about the labor. It's been a while,
but I'm
a union supporter.
But you put this together in such a creative, really interesting way. Tie into community wellness with your political activities that you've been involved in your whole life, in creating a more vibrant as I said in the beginning, vibrant participatory democracy. You've really come, in a way, combined things in a way that I think is so down to earth and yet so politically revolutionary and so necessary. As I hearing you describe the program here, it's just fabulous. It really is.
Well, this really crosses all lines, though. There's not
I'm trying to say.
a political viewpoint for curing asthma. Any parent that sees their child struggling to breathe wants to do something that will put their child out of that terror of choking, of suffocating. And if you've ever had to hold your breath or haven't been able to breathe, you know there's just a terror involved in that. And nobody wants that for their child. And the social cost is a problem and something that everybody of every political viewpoint wants to reduce. So certainly you have to have a healthy, educated population to have a democracy. You can't have people self-govern if they can't think, if they can't breathe, if they're not healthy. So it's absolutely essential for a democracy, yes. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
and healthcare is a right for everybody. We want a healthy society. So in that sense, there is a political aspect to it. But in the other sense, it's just pure human instinct and desire to have your child be healthy and be everything that they possibly can be in life.
Well put. And I think that's a perfect way to end the show, because our voice and our breath is essential to life.
Exactly.
Thank you so very, very much for being here, Judy.
I'm so glad. Thank you for letting me talk about this. And I really do encourage people, if you are interested in this or have any experience with music helping your asthma, to let us know.
We'll do our best here, too, on the Radical Imagination. Thank you again, Judy. We'll see you soon.
Bye. Thanks so much, Jim.
Bye-bye. And thank you all very, very, very much for watching the Radical Imagination this week. We'll see you again next week on the Radical Imagination.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, my name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Roosevelt, Mississippi, Sunflower County, the home of Senator James O. Eastland and Senator Stennis. It was the 31st of August in 1962 that 18 of us traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse in Indianola to try to register to become first-class citizens. We was met in Indianola by policemen, highway patrolmen, and they only allowed 2 of us in to take the literacy test at the time. After we had taken this test and started back to Roosevelt, we was held up by the city police and the state highway patrolmen and carried back to Indianola, where the bus driver was charged that day with driving a bus the wrong color. After we paid the fine among us, we continued on to Roosevelt, and Reverend Jeff Sonny carried me 4 miles in the rural area where I had worked as a timekeeper and sharecropper for 18 years. I was met there by my children that told me the plantation owner was angry because I had gone down, tried to register. After they told me, my husband came and said the plantation owner was raising Cain because I had tried to register. And before he quit talking, the plantation owner came and said, Fannie Lou, do you know, did Pap tell you what I said? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I mean that, said, if you don't go down and withdraw your registration, you will have to leave. that then if you go down and withdraw, that you still might have to go because we are not ready for that in Mississippi. And I addressed him and told him that I didn't try to register for you. I tried to register for myself. I had to leave that same night. All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings in America? Thank you.